Some days the mind feels crowded. Thoughts push in, restless, tugging the mood off balance. And underneath it all sits that faint doubt about why happiness slips so easily. Analysis begins there, in the simple but unsettling pattern. The emotional drift often follows the direction of the thoughts held closest. A quiet link, almost mechanical. Marcus Aurelius put it plainly, noting that happiness leans on the quality of one's thoughts. The idea isn't decorative. It acts like a mirror. Strip away the noise, and the mood reveals what the mind has been feeding it. A small shift in perspective, a sharp pause. This leads into the core of the approach, where inner peace is not treated as a luxury, but as a discipline. Strength is not a posture. It's the steady act of managing the inner field before it spills outward. The struggle isn't with circumstances. It's with the reactions shaping themselves inside, long before a word is spoken or an action is taken. Some moments feel heavy because attention drifts toward what cannot be shaped. Then the mind tightens, tired and unfocused. A quiet correction helps. Find the part that can be steered. Hold it. Let the rest fall away. Just that. And so the promise unfolds gently. The principles that follow are not shortcuts or bright slogans. They are meant to clear space, not to add weight. A slow return to what can actually be governed. A reminder that happiness is less a pursuit and more a construction, built from the small, consistent choices made within. One thought at a time, one pause at a time. A still point forming in the background, a place you can return to. Gratitude feels like a quiet shift in how the world appears. It doesn't change the noise around me, yet it changes the weight of it. A small turn of the mind, a softer breath in the same room. And in that shift, something settles, something steadier. A simple lens, a quieter one. There is an old practice from a ruler long gone, a habit of greeting the day by noticing what was already present instead of what was missing. Not a ritual of praise, not a search for comfort, just a calm review of what stood ready to support him before the world demanded anything. I think about that sometimes. The clarity of beginning a morning that way, a still start. Gratitude works best as a rhythm, not a spark. A steady, grounded return to things easily overlooked. It asks for presence, not intensity. It meets the day without fanfare. And it grows slowly, almost unnoticed, until it becomes the baseline instead of the exception. A quiet discipline, a simple anchor. Entitlement creeps in when I move too fast. When I assume the path should bend to me. When I treat what I have as a given instead of a gift, it drains energy without making anything better. Gratitude cuts through that fog. It reminds me that nothing is owed, that nothing is guaranteed. And in that recognition, the mind loosens. A sharp correction, a cleaner view. Hard moments test this the most. When plans fracture, when effort meets silence, when fatigue presses against the ribs. Gratitude doesn't erase any of it. It just keeps the moment from swallowing everything. It finds a single point of light in the dark and holds it without asking for more. Not to feel better, only to stay upright. A small flame. Enough. Practicing this feels like tending a thread, returning to it before the tension snaps. Naming what remains steady when so much shifts. It isn't dramatic. It isn't grand. It's the act of keeping myself from drifting too far from center. The mind pauses. The breath follows. And even for a moment, the ground feels firm again. A brief stillness. A reminder. Sometimes the mind feels like it moves on its own, drifting toward whatever is loudest. A small thought becomes a weight. A small noise becomes a pull. And in that quiet recognition, there is a reminder that the mind can be shaped, not just watched. A reminder that training is not dramatic. It is subtle, slow, steady, a pause, a small correction. There is a certain honesty that appears when seeing how easily the mind bends under pressure, how it jumps to conclusions, how it clings to comfort. It becomes clear that resilience is not something granted by circumstance. It grows only when tested from within. A steady mind does not rise from ease. It forms through friction, through the moments that stretch patience thin and make control feel distant. Stillness becomes a choice, a quiet one. It is striking how the untrained mind reveals itself in the smallest moments. A rush of irritation, a habit of assuming the worst, a fear that grows faster than reason can catch it. These aren't dramatic flaws. They are tiny openings where attention slips away, and noticing them is uncomfortable. It feels like holding a mirror too close. Yet that discomfort is the first doorway. A simple truth: the mind needs direction. Training begins in places most people overlook. In a breath taken before reacting. In the space between impulse and response. In the choice to pause when impatience rises. These are small acts, almost invisible from the outside. But they are the quiet work that strengthens the inner frame. Repetition gives shape. Consistency gives weight. And slowly, the mind learns to return to itself instead of scattering at every disruption. A small practice, again and again. Over time, something shifts. Calmness stops feeling like a rare visitor and becomes a steady companion. Not a perfect one, not always present, but close enough to reach. The trained mind is not rigid. It does not brace against life. It moves through it without losing itself. Calm becomes less about silence around you and more about silence within you. A grounded space, a place to stand, a moment of clarity, just enough. There is a strange pattern that emerges when looking closely at how the mind behaves. It leans away from anything that stings, anything that disrupts comfort, anything that demands effort. The avoidance feels logical at first, a quiet retreat from friction. Yet the retreat grows into habit, and the habit grows into a quiet fear of anything slightly hard. It becomes a softness that seems harmless until it starts pulling the strings. A soft pull, but steady. A pause here, a hesitation there. And suddenly, a small discomfort feels larger than it is, larger than it should be, larger than you want it to be. A simple truth sits underneath it. Avoiding what hurts does not always protect. Sometimes it shrinks who you are. Pause here. There is a certain clarity in the old advice to practice poverty, not as punishment, not as drama, but as a deliberate step back from the illusion that comfort is owed. Stripping life down for a moment reveals what is essential and what is only noise. It exposes what remains firm when everything extra is removed. That firmness is quiet, steady, unaffected by loss or gain. It is not about pretending to suffer. It is about seeing how little you actually need and how strong you already are without the layers you cling to. A small truth surfaces. Simplicity frees the mind. Let it settle. There is a line that repeats itself in the background of life. It will not always bring you soft beds. You know this already. You feel it on the days that hit harder than expected. The days when the ground is not even and the air feels sharp. On those days, the absence of comfort is not the real problem. The shock is. The surprise is. The sense that you were not ready. And that feeling lingers. It lingers because you hoped softness would last longer than it did. A sharp line cuts through the thought. Life owes no softness. Hold that line for a moment. In this world, voluntary discomfort becomes a quiet practice. Not dramatic, not heroic, just purposeful. Choosing the colder path for a moment. Choosing the harder option for a day. Choosing less when more is available. Small things, barely noticeable to anyone else. But each choice carves a space inside you where resilience can breathe. The practice is not about proving strength. It is about remembering it. A simple reminder. You are not as fragile as comfort makes you feel. Let it rest. The benefits of this practice reveal themselves slowly. A clearer mind, a steadier breath, a calmer response when things shift unexpectedly. The discomfort stops feeling like an enemy and becomes a companion that teaches without speaking. You begin to stand a little firmer in situations that once unsettled you. Not because they hurt less, but because your fear of them fades. The fading is gentle, but real. Hold that softness. Fear loosens its grip when discomfort becomes familiar. Not conquered, just familiar. The unknown loses its edge. The mind stops imagining worst-case endings for every small difficulty. A steadier rhythm emerges, a sense that you can walk toward what feels uneasy without collapsing under it. And the fear thins out, quietly, almost imperceptibly, until you notice that the things that once controlled you now pass through you like weather. A final truth lands. Discomfort, welcomed in small doses, returns your freedom. It's strange how easily the present slips away the moment it's needed most. A quiet theft, a moment ignored, and it leaves behind a faint sting, as if something essential was missed without even noticing. There's a certain weight in realizing how often the mind runs from the very moment it's standing in. It races ahead, building scenes that may never happen. It digs backward, replaying lines that can't be changed. And beneath all of that movement, the present waits. Still, steady, unmoved. A small truth that's uncomfortable to face. There's a harsh clarity in admitting that presence doesn't come naturally. It's not a gift. It's not a personality trait. It's effort. It asks for discipline at the exact times the mind wants to wander most. And there's no shortcut through that. Just the steady practice of noticing when the mind drifts and guiding it back without drama. A simple act, but never an easy one. The more it's practiced, the more the present begins to change its shape. A moment stops feeling like a blur to get through and becomes something sharper, more grounded. Even the small things take on a kind of clarity that wasn't there before. Tension softens, noise fades, and what's left is a quieter sense of being here, instead of being scattered across a dozen unfinished thoughts. A pause, a breath, a brief return to what's real. But this clarity doesn't hold itself. It asks for repetition, constant effort, sometimes to the point of frustration. Because the mind always wants to drift back into the familiar patterns, worrying, anticipating, reliving. Pulling it back requires patience, the kind that feels tedious on the surface, but builds something solid underneath. And every return to presence is a small act of reclaiming control. A reminder that the moment isn't lost unless it's abandoned. Stay here, right here. Desire grows when left unattended. It stretches itself into every corner, subtle at first, then loud. It feeds on the smallest hint of dissatisfaction and turns it into a chase that never truly ends. There is a quiet moment when this becomes obvious, a moment when the mind recognizes the pattern and sees how easily it gets pulled. And the pull feels familiar, almost comfortable, until it isn't. The realization lands with a simple truth. Endless isn't a direction, it's a trap. Living under the weight of desire feels like carrying a chain you don't remember putting on. Each new craving adds another link, light on its own, but heavy in total. The surprising part is how normal it becomes, how easy it is to mistake the chain for momentum. The pace quickens, the breath shortens, and the mind keeps reaching for the next thing, certain that relief is just a little farther ahead. Yet the pressure never loosens. The chain tightens. Quietly. Desire shows up in many forms, not only the obvious ones. It hides in small urges, subtle comparisons, the restless search for validation that doesn't even sound like desire when spoken aloud. It hides in the need to be seen a certain way, in the need to match an expectation no one actually asked for, and in the subtle tug of wanting control over what can't be controlled. These quiet versions are the ones that slip through easily, unnoticed until they've already shaped the tone of an entire day. They settle in the background, almost invisible. The chase promises happiness, but often creates friction instead. The more the mind reaches, the more it notices what it hasn't grasped. The gap widens, the mood tightens, and the sense of lack deepens in places that were once calm. There's a strange irony in realizing that the pursuit meant to fill something only hollows it out further. A moment of stillness can expose that hollow space clearly, like a quiet echo. The echo is enough. Training becomes essential, not as punishment, but as a slow strengthening of awareness. A steady return to the present moment. The mind learns to watch the rise of desire without immediately following it. Some days the pull feels strong, other days barely noticeable. The training is in showing up anyway, in noticing the shift before it takes over. The work is subtle, almost plain from the outside, but inside, it steadies everything. Mastering desire brings a kind of clarity that feels like a deep breath after holding one for too long. The noise softens. Priorities realign. The mind stops scattering itself in every direction and turns toward what matters with a quieter focus. It isn't a dramatic revelation, more like a gentle sorting. What stays, what goes, what no longer deserves attention. Clarity settles. And in that stillness, life feels lighter. There's a moment that appears in the quiet of an ordinary day, when something small goes wrong and the mind tightens. A delay, a misunderstanding, a plan that slips out of place. And in that brief pause, it's easy to feel the push of frustration rising before anything is even understood. But the thought lingers. Do not curse the obstacle. Use it. The line sits heavy, almost reluctant, as if the mind wants to ignore it and move on. Yet there's a strange steadiness in letting the obstruction breathe. In noticing how quickly irritation tries to take command, in recognizing how often energy is spent fighting what has already arrived. A still voice follows. This moment can shape you, if you let it. Just that. Simple, uncomfortable. Then the mind shifts, even if only a little. The Stoic mind adapts and learns, not because it is naturally calm, but because it refuses to be carried away. There's a slow, deliberate softening that happens when the focus moves from resistance to response. Not a forced optimism, not a fantasy about everything working out. More like a quiet acceptance that the mind is capable of meeting this moment, even if imperfectly. The tension loosens by degrees. The breath becomes steadier. A new angle appears. In that space, life feels less like a series of disruptions and more like a constant training ground. Not a battlefield, not a punishment, a place to practice the small movements of inner steadiness, to practice catching the first spark of impatience before it burns through the moment, to practice noticing the urge to run, to react, to tighten. Every obstacle becomes another repetition, another weight lifted, Another chance to grow heavier in discipline, lighter in complaint. The strength of this principle lies not in force, but in perception. Something subtle shifts when the mind stops asking, "Why now?" and instead wonders, "What is this showing me?" That shift changes the tone of everything. The same event, the same difficulty, the same pressure. Yet it feels different because it is seen differently. Perception becomes a doorway, sometimes narrow, sometimes dark, but always open. Stepping through it is the work. And somewhere in that stillness, a final question rises. Soft, persistent. How can you train yourself to turn obstacles into opportunities? The answer doesn't appear all at once. It forms slowly, in moments when the world isn't watching, in the choice to pause before reacting, in the willingness to stay with discomfort without letting it define the moment, in the quiet practice of returning to the center, even after drifting far from it. Little by little, the mind learns. Little by little, the obstacle reshapes itself, not into something easier, but into something meaningful. A small shift, a steady breath, a clearer view. There is a quiet weight that settles in the mind when the thought appears. Remember that you must die. It doesn't shout, it doesn't threaten. It just rests there, steady and unmovable, like a hand on the shoulder, reminding me that nothing I hold is permanent. And somehow that clarity softens the noise inside. A simple truth, a still point. When the shortness of life slips from awareness, the days blur. The hours stretch in vague shapes. Focus thins. Energy scatters. It becomes easy to move as if time were endless, as if every delay could be forgiven by some future abundance that may never come. A strange drifting begins, a feeling of being carried by currents I didn't choose. And then the quiet sting hits. None of this is guaranteed. Not even the next breath. A sharp pause. Yet the thought of death is not a shadow spreading over everything. It's not meant to drown the heart in dread or darken the morning. It simply strips away the excess. It removes the fog. It clears the clutter of imagined fears and self-made expectations. There's a kind of lightness in it, a reminder that this moment is already enough, a soft return. There is also a gentler lesson hidden in mortality. When life is known to be brief, pride loses its grip. The urge to tower over others feels hollow. The need to prove something fades before it can harden into habit. Nothing that inflates the ego can survive long under the thought that every achievement, every praise, every possession will eventually pass into silence. And that silence is honest. It cuts through the illusion of being more than human. Just human. Only human. And that is enough. But the question lingers. How to hold this awareness without sinking into despair? How to keep it close without letting it darken the mind? The answer feels more like a practice than a rule. A quiet returning. A gentle touch of perspective when impatience rises. When frustration tightens the chest. When self-criticism grows sharp. Just a breath taken with the knowledge that time is limited. Not to scare, to steady. A brief pause that realigns the inner compass. One small reminder that turns urgency into presence. One small reminder that turns fear into focus. One small reminder that turns the ordinary into something worth holding. Just a moment. Then the next. You feel it, don't you? That slight tremble inside when the day gets loud and your mind slips. A quiet proof that no one is free who is not master of himself. The world doesn't even need to push hard. A single distraction can pull you off course. And in that moment, the truth stares back. The lack of control cuts deeper than any outside pressure. It shows how easy it is to hand over the reins without noticing. A sharp pause, a reminder that freedom starts inside, or it doesn't start at all. There's a certain heaviness in seeing the image of an untrained soul. It wanders from impulse to impulse, always reacting, never choosing. Exhaustion becomes its default rhythm. It chases comfort, yet keeps slipping into restlessness, unsure why nothing ever settles. And there's something almost painful in that drift, as if the person inside is half awake, tugged in directions they never meant to go. No anchor, no still point, just movement without intention. So the work of building an inner fortress is not arrogance, but wisdom. A slow, steady architecture formed from the inside out. Not to hide, not to harden, but to protect the clarity that keeps life from scattering into noise. A fortress that doesn't wall the world out, but keeps your center intact when the world presses in. There's a quiet dignity in that. A sense of standing on your own ground without needing anyone to hold you upright. It feels clean. It feels earned. A simple truth held firmly. But to strengthen that fortress, you must first recognize the enemy at the gate. And it's rarely something dramatic. More often, it's the tiny unrest you keep brushing aside. The impatience that slips in before you catch it. The self-doubt that whispers when you're tired. The urge to run from discomfort instead of meeting it with open eyes. These small intrusions shape the mind more than the big storms ever do. They sneak in quietly, shaping the tone of your days. Naming them matters. Seeing them without flinching matters. One clear breath and the gate is no longer undefended. Daily practice becomes essential, not because repetition is noble, but because the mind forgets fast. It drifts back to old patterns when left alone. So the fortress must be tended like a fire that weakens if ignored. A few steady moments each day, observing, adjusting, returning to yourself, are enough to keep the structure alive. Not grand rituals, just honest attention. The kind of attention that slowly strengthens the walls you rely on when the night gets heavy. And over time, the effort becomes lighter than the chaos it prevents. Simple, quiet, steady. It begins as a quiet realization. The sense that chasing pleasure has never really steadied anything inside. Moments of excitement rise, then vanish, leaving the same restlessness waiting underneath. So the thought returns, slow and persistent. There is something firmer than comfort, something that doesn't disappear. Virtue, a simple word, a heavy anchor. To see it as the highest good is to feel a shift in the center of a life. Pleasure comes and goes with every mood and circumstance. But virtue stays within reach, even on difficult days. It offers a direction, not a sensation. A place to stand when the ground feels thin. And the mind, tired from running in circles, finds a rare stillness in choosing what feels honest over what feels easy. A moment of clarity, a pause. Choosing virtue over pleasure carries its own quiet form of freedom, not the kind that promises endless options, but the kind that frees you from being dragged by every craving. There's relief in that. A soft permission to step back from the impulses that rush in, demanding attention, promising relief they never deliver. When virtue leads, pleasure loses its grip, and the heart stops negotiating with itself every hour. It just moves steadily toward what matters. Steady is the key. But what does it truly mean to choose virtue? Not a dramatic shift, not a grand pledge. More like a return to the values you already know hold your life together when everything gets loud. A return to honesty, restraint, clarity, steadiness, and the quiet courage to hold yourself to them even when no one is watching, especially then. A simple truth. There is no shortcut to inner coherence. It's built choice by choice. small, steady choices. The modern world makes those choices feel almost unnatural. Everything reaches for attention, pushing urgency into places where none is needed. Pleasure hides in every corner. Quick comfort, instant escape, constant noise. It's easy to drift without noticing the drift. Easy to mistake stimulation for satisfaction. But beneath all that motion, the mind grows tired. And in that tiredness, the pull toward something more stable becomes harder to ignore. A quiet pull, a necessary one. Choosing virtue also reshapes the way difficulty lands inside you. Hard moments stop feeling like insults. They become spaces where you watch yourself act, seeing whether you hold your ground or abandon it. Difficulty becomes a mirror, not a punishment. Sometimes the reflection is steady, sometimes it stings. But either way, it's honest. And honesty, even when uncomfortable, has a way of clearing the fog that pleasure only thickens. A clearing, a breath. In practice, choosing virtue over pleasure each day feels ordinary, almost unimpressive. It shows up in the small moments when you pause before reacting, when you follow through instead of drifting, when you hold a line you set for yourself, even when comfort whispers in your ear. Some days you'll falter. Some days you'll rise without effort, but the choice remains available, quietly waiting behind every impulse. It asks only for sincerity, not perfection. One grounded step at a time. That's enough. Gratitude is not a shallow exercise. It moves quietly under the surface, shaping the way the mind touches the world. It settles the restless pull that keeps reaching for something else. It softens the tightness that forms when exhaustion lingers too long. And in that softening, a small clarity appears. A pause. A reminder that meaning is rarely loud. Gratitude transforms little into enough and enough into abundance. Not by adding anything new, but by revealing what was hidden behind impatience. There is a shift that happens when the mind stops counting what is missing and notices what already supports it. The air slows. The grip on more loosens. Even the smallest piece of stability feels fuller when it is finally seen. Enough becomes a quiet anchor. Gratitude ends this cycle by anchoring you to the present and teaching you that what you already have is sufficient. The cycle that tightens around desire, around comparison, around the fear of falling behind. It breaks the loop by meeting the moment without demanding more from it. There is relief in that acceptance, a still point, a place where the mind stops running. Gratitude also strengthens resilience. It reminds you that even in difficulty, some part of life still holds. A single steady thing can carry you through a long night if you let it. And when the day feels heavy, that awareness keeps you from collapsing into old habits of escape. It gives weight to small acts of endurance. It gives shape to inner steadiness, strong enough. Gratitude humbles you, not by diminishing you, but by clearing away the illusion of control you keep trying to maintain. It shows how much of your life rests on things you never commanded. How many quiet supports have carried you without asking for recognition. The realization settles deep. It steadies the ego. It makes space for a calmer kind of strength. Just enough. How do you practice Stoic gratitude daily? By noticing without forcing. By pausing before the next demand forms in your mind. By acknowledging one simple thing that holds your life together today, even if it feels small. The practice is not grand. It does not need rituals or perfect moments. It needs only a willingness to stop long enough for reality to be seen. A breath, a quiet nod to what remains, and the discipline to return to that place again. There's a certain clarity that appears when looking back at the 10 principles as a whole. a pattern forms, not a lesson, just a quiet structure. Each principle points inward, tracing the same direction through different angles. Control, perception, discipline, intention, acceptance, steadiness. They move like separate threads that keep pulling toward the same center. And as that center sharpens, something settles. A sense that the work has always been the same work. A slow returning to what can be shaped from within. A small truth, always waiting. The practice itself carries a weight that theory never reveals. There's a gap between understanding and living, and the gap can feel fun on certain days. When the mind is tired, when patience thins, when the old habits come back louder than expected. The principles remain simple, but the applying of them is not. It asks for attention. It asks for presence. Not dramatic effort, just a steady willingness to return, again and again, until returning becomes its own rhythm, quiet, reliable. Living this way rarely feels effortless. It strips away excuses and leaves only what is done or not done. There's no hiding in stories about the world, no soft padding to lean on, just the inner terrain with all its weather. And there are days when that terrain feels messy, restless, uncooperative. Yet even then, there's a certain steadiness that appears when one stands with it instead of fighting it. A small pause, a breath that lands a little deeper, a reminder that difficulty does not mean failure, just effort, just life. The closing truth is this: happiness is possible. Not the kind that flashes bright and vanishes. Something quieter. Something that grows when the noise inside loses its authority. And it's strange how often this truth waits behind ordinary moments. The ones that feel unremarkable. The small pauses that the mind usually rushes through. There's a softness there, a door half open, easy to miss, easy to enter. And somewhere in all of this, the path keeps narrowing down to a single point, a choice. Not dramatic, not heroic, just a simple direction the mind can take in any moment, toward what strengthens it, or away, toward what steadies it, or not. The world stays the same. The events keep unfolding. But the inner movement can shift, quietly, imperfectly, honestly. A slow breath, a small pivot, a private decision no one else will ever see.